While you were sleeping last night, the Senate, on a vote 51-48, passed the rescission package, passed down from from the White House. Now, that's a technical way of saying, for the first time in my lifetime, a Congress has agreed to pull back funds that they had already allocated and say, yeah, we don't need to spend the American taxpayers' money on that. They actually had a president and a White House send money back to them saying, we don't want it, we don't need it. And Congress said, okay, then we won't spend it. Can you believe that? That's amazing. Even better, the money that was going to be spent, the Democrats demanded be spent, well, it was money for ridiculous, woke, international projects under USAID, which is now defunct, thank God. And it was money allocated for the budgets for the next 2 years of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's right. PBS and NPR. Finally, you are no longer paying for left-wing propaganda known as public broadcasting. This was the final vote right there on the floor of the Senate, 51-48. In fact, it's interesting. A day ago, we had a procedural vote that was tied 50-50, and they needed J.D. Vance to break the tie. So why now did it go 51-49? Mitch McConnell, of all people, who voted no on that procedural vote, decided to come to his senses, and he voted the right way last night. So at least that part of his legacy is not tarnished, and good for Senator McConnell. Now, during the debate on the floor of the Senate, Senator Ted Cruz sort of summed up the outrageous idea that your tax dollars should go to left-wing propaganda paid for by the government, like state-sponsored left-wing propaganda known as PBS and NPR. Take it away, Senator Cruz.
Mr. President, public broadcasting has long been overtaken by partisan activists, plain and simple. This isn't just an abstract critique. NPR and PBS have revealed their left-wing bias time and time again. When blowing the whistle on NPR, Uri Berliner, a former senior editor, himself a left-wing Democrat, wrote that, quote, NPR has always had a liberal bent. An open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR. We don't have an audience that reflects America. Exhibit A, after the New York Post broke the Hunter Biden laptop story, NPR ran political cover for the Democrats, refusing to cover the story. Quote, we don't want to waste listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions. Mind you, the story was true. That's why they didn't want to cover it. As for PBS, its coverage of last year's DNC was only 12% negative. The RNC, a staggering 72% negative. If you want to watch left-wing propaganda, turn on MSNBC. But the taxpayers should not be forced to subsidize it. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Well, he summed it up perfectly, and it's perfectly logical too. Listen, when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was first created back in the late 60s, we only had 3 broadcast networks and then a thing that was called UHF. I know you youngsters don't know what that means, but we used to have VHF channels, which were channels 2 through 13, and then UHF channels. You had 2 different sets of antennas on the set. I know I sound like a boomer. I'm not. I'm a Gen Xer, but I'm old enough to remember that garbage. And back then, we had those 3 networks, and then you had all of the UHF local independent stations, and somebody had the bright idea of coming up with this idea of government-funded public broadcasting. And they said, sure, that's fine. And I guess in the early years, and certainly on public television, they decided to do things like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers and Julia Child's cooking show and what have you. And I guess that was good and it was positive. Electric Company was pretty hip. I liked that. There was a show called Zoom. I barely remember. Anyway, the point is, for a while there, it seemed like children's programming and importing some classic BBC shows and calling it masterpiece theater in primetime made sense. But that's not what PBS is anymore. And it's certainly not what NPR is if you ever tune into that. By the way, why did we ever need government-funded radio? I mean, how many radio stations are there across the board? And for a while there, they said AM radio was going to die. But then Rush Limbaugh resuscitated it, and AM radio continues to flourish. It's outrageous to think that the federal government should pay for this sort of thing when we can't afford to keep the lights on in other parts of our country, number one. But number two, if you are going to pay for it, it certainly shouldn't be government-funded propaganda. That goes against everything we believe as Americans, period. End of story. We don't live in the world of the late 1960s anymore. We have a lot more channels, and we don't have to futz with the little antenna on the top of the set to get them to tune in. It's ridiculous. That being said, faced with an existential threat to their cushy little lifestyle in a media platform that they don't have to worry about competing with any actual real competitors, well, the CEOs of those corporate broadcasting systems, they put up quite a fight. And the way they fought was to go on cable news, make their case, and lie, which, by the way, I don't quite understand this. You see, if my show was about to be canceled, you wouldn't see me going on my competitors' networks and platforms to make a plea for my job to be saved, right? I would appeal to you. I would appeal to my audience and say, hey, my show is going to be canceled. Help me out. Help me out. So why is the chairman, CEO of PBS going on CNN to plead her case? And it's kind of funny. I'm pretty sure CNN even has a smaller audience than PBS does at this point. So right there, that's kind of an odd thing to do, isn't it? Well, and then, she just lied.
I ask them for examples. People often struggle to come up with examples of what really they're talking about. So we're always interested, obviously, in making sure that we're serving a multiplicity of viewpoints. You know, Bill Buckley made his home on public broadcasting with a series called Firing Line, which continues today with Margaret Hoover. We are interested in having different perspectives that we bring forward. But when I look at the range of our programmings on public broadcasting, I can't make any sense of an argument that we are somehow biased in any way.
First of all, William F. Buckley, rest his soul, has not been on PBS for about 20 years now. And when you have to raise him as the example of, hey, we love conservatives, and then Margaret Hoover, who's taken over. Yeah, Margaret Hoover was the approved replacement. PBS approved of her replacing William F. Buckley on Firing Line. Have you ever seen that picture of the 4 liberals on the CNN set where they were all putting their hands up during the fake, phony, hands up, don't shoot racial hoax of the Obama era? You've seen that picture before, right? It's laughable. It's these 4 liberal commentators on CNN, and they've all got their hands up because they're super serious, because they care. In fact, one of the people on that panel is Sunny Hostin, who ended up being one of the crazy screaming women on The View, right? Guess what? Guess who else is one of those 4 women? Margaret Hoover. The super conservative that your CEO of PBS just claimed as a perfect example of the kind of far right-wing commentary they deliver. That said, as you heard from the beginning here, she struggles to find examples of political bias at PBS, right? Isn't that what she said? She struggles to find it?
I ask them for examples. People often struggle to come up with examples of.
Yeah, they struggle to come up with examples. Well, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, he doesn't struggle in any way whatsoever. He put together a thread on X to show some perfectly easy to discover examples of that bias. Here's a little bit of it.
From Louisiana Public Broadcasting. Becoming Papa, father's key to gender justice. I can tell you that's every mom and dad in Louisiana, when they lie down to sleep at night, and they can't, they're lying there worried about gender justice. Not. I mean, the article, the title of the article suggests what you ought to believe. It's not fair or balanced. Here's another one. Transgender athletes seek protections to play sport.
Yeah, and also the middle one is my favorite too. Religion and public life, abortion and welfare. So that's just one set of examples from John Kennedy, but he wasn't done. He had another one. I'm sorry, you're struggling to find the political bias at PBS? John Kennedy ain't struggling.
Here are a couple that you saw on that you saw on television, PBS, paid for with your tax dollars. First headline, talking to young children about race and racism. Another headline, how America's history of racism connects to divisions today. Another headline from PBS, the hidden racism of young white Americans. Your tax dollars. Another headline, AP fact check, Trump seeds race animus with COVID falsehood.
I'll jump in here for a second because I'm sure many of you are old enough to remember, 5 years ago, that racist falsehood that Trump was seeding, the COVID falsehood that he was seeding race animus with, that was by claiming that the COVID-19 virus originated in the lab in Wuhan, China. That was the falsehood that Trump was seeding race animus with. And that's a PBS story on the PBS website. I love it when Kennedy brings receipts. Remember just a few minutes ago when you saw the CEO of PBS say that people struggle to find any kind of political bias in their reporting? I think I've discovered the problem here. I think the CEO of PBS doesn't actually watch PBS. That's the only explanation.
Another headline, Biden trumpets economic gains but struggles to get credit. Another headline from PBS, the other Olympians, transgender athletes in the Nazi era,
actually. And the last one that we don't have time for here, debunking common myths about gender affirming care for youth. In fact, if you're using the term gender affirming care for youth, you're already displaying your bias because you chose those words on purpose. All right. He's not done. John Kennedy's got more. I'm sorry, PBS. You struggled to find the bias that you used to do with our tax dollars?
Here's more. Democracy on Trial, Part 1. A blueprint for the case against Trump. Is that fair and balanced? From PBS. Racism in the era of Trump, an oral history, another headline. January 13th, 2020. Another. This one's really special. A serial liar. How Sarah Palin ushered in the post-truth political era in which Trump has thrived.
There you go. That's kind of a twofer. You get to go after Sarah Palin and Donald Trump at the same time. And John Kennedy finished his thread there by saying, thanks to President Trump's rescission package, taxpayers may finally be able to get out of the business of deeply weird left-wing media. And that's a good thing. By the way, just so you know, the vote's not done. Yes, it passed the Senate, but they added an amendment because the Senate just can't leave well enough alone. If they had just passed the bill that came out of the House, it'd be over. It'd be on Trump's desk right now. But no, they put one amendment in, so now the House has to vote on it again. I interviewed a couple of congressmen this morning, talked to a couple offline. They say it's going to happen. So your tax dollars will no longer fund this propaganda that you find so offensive. And that's a very, very good thing. Even more so, setting aside the propaganda aspect of it, we have no business paying for television and radio stations. For God's sake, it's not like television and radio stations are a scarcity in this culture. In fact, people are getting audio content without even turning on the radio now with the advent of the internet and streaming devices and podcasts. Give me a break. Meanwhile, that argument died. It died a fiery, noble death. The argument that there's nothing politically biased about us. We know that's not the case. So then they tried another argument. It was a lie, but they tried it. Here's Chuck Schumer laying out the argument.
And these cuts to local stations couldn't happen at a worse time, with floods and natural disasters front of mind. When a flood happens, when a tornado touches down, when a hurricane makes landfall, people need immediate, up-to-date alerts to stay safe. And sometimes, all too often, public broadcasting is the only way for people to hear what's going on. It's a matter of life and death. So why is Donald Trump so hell-bent on taking away funding from local stations that can literally save lives?
That's right. People are going to die without NPR. That is, if there's anybody left out there, because I thought everybody died when net neutrality was removed back in 2018, I think it was. No, that was 2015. People are going to die because during natural disasters like floods and tornadoes, you need your public station, especially people in rural areas. Remember that talking point. We're going to blow it away in just a moment. First of all, you already know right now that you get alerts all the time on your smartphones, on your devices, everywhere in the world you get alerts, right? But he specifically said floods. Remember that for a second as we show you Dana Bash on CNN dutifully repeating the exact same talking point as if it's fact, as if it's news. Watch what she does in the middle of reading one of President Trump's posts on Truth Social.
He wrote, "It's very important that all Republicans adhere to my rescissions bill and in particular defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting," which is worse than, I'm not even going to read that. "Any Republican that votes to allow this monstrosity to continue broadcasting will not have my endorsement."
I think one of the most interesting groups of people to watch in this are the rural Republicans in the Senate and the House, and on all of these issues, because so many of them are affecting rural communities, and public schools are the center of small towns in America. And my understanding from Democrats who cover rural areas is they don't think that they can exactly win rural America, but they say they're being heard in a way that they have never been before, and maybe they can lose less badly. And so I just think of tariffs, USAID, and SNAP, which the agriculture community funds or sells their product to, these are all putting stress on rural communities.
And rural communities rely on public broadcasting still.
That too.
And public education.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There it was. Rural communities rely on public broadcasting. You hear it all the time. They're all saying that. Rural communities. You dumb podunk Southerners, you don't know how to turn on anything else and get information from anywhere else. You don't got them internets down where you live. So you got to have your public station so you can find out what the crop temperatures are or something. I don't know. It's ridiculous. I can't even improv and fake a scenario where you would need NPR to figure out what's going on in your community. It's ridiculous on the face of it. And I'll explain two reasons why you know it's ridiculous. The first is thanks to our friends at the Media Research Center who, well, they research the media. And, you know, Chuck Schumer and this reporter just there, Abby Livingston, they both pointed out that if there's a natural disaster, flooding, Chuck Schumer said in particular, they rely on NPR. They rely on the public stations for their emergency alerts. But a funny thing, we just had a flood. Remember the devastating, horrific flash flood in Texas? You know, Kerrville, Texas was the sort of epicenter of that entire thing. And everybody's alerts went off. You know, radio stations all across the band are part of the emergency broadcast system. I work on a radio station in Washington, D.C. It's privately owned. It's publicly available. It's not NPR. And we are part of the emergency broadcast system. So there is an emergency. Our broadcasting gets interrupted for emergency broadcast. And then when the alert is over, you go back to your regularly scheduled programming. But you see, at our radio station that I work at, if there was a local catastrophe or emergency, a giant flash flood or a tornado, we have a news team. We have personnel. We have me. I can connect to the radio station from my home, and I can begin giving alerts and giving information and giving you live broadcasts in real time about what's going on in your community. That's what radio stations do coast to coast in this country if they serve their communities. Guess what happened in Kerrville, Texas, when the flash floods came and the river overflowed, the Guadalupe River, and all those people died? Guess what NPR did? They had the alert because it's part of the emergency broadcast system. Then they went back to their regular programming, which was based out of Washington, D.C. It was a nationally syndicated show, Morning Edition, where the content at that time, while the floods were overflowing in Texas, the content was stories about Donald Trump lying about the reconciliation bill that just passed the House and about how the reconciliation bill was going to starve people and kick them off of Medicare. They didn't have anything in Kerrville, Texas. The local stations there were dead silent. Radio silence, we say in the business. It's a lie. The entire thing is a lie. It's also demeaning and disgraceful to people in these rural communities to suggest that they have no other way of getting information. How in the hell did they grow crops and do farming and be able to save themselves when there were tornadoes and earthquakes or what have you before 1968 when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was founded? Somehow they figured it out. because it's a lie. One other thing about this. You see the CEO of PBS, the CEO of NPR, you see Chuck Schumer, you see Dana Bash. You see, look at this panel. It's 5 well-educated, elitist journalists from Washington, D.C., all telling each other that rural poor communities require NPR so that they can get news and information at any given time. We've had television show after television show doing this exact same segment for the last several weeks. We've had hearings in the House and the Senate about NPR and about PBS, and you've had the CEOs parrot this exact same talking point over and over again. Have you noticed what you haven't seen? Have you noticed what you haven't heard? On every single one of these cable news segments, just like the one you see right here, and in every single one of the House and Senate hearings about the vital need of NPR in these rural communities so that they get their farming and weather and emergency information, they never had a person from those communities saying that. They didn't find one person to come to Washington, D.C., and under oath testify and say to a congressman, please don't take away my NPR. It's the only way I get information about weather, about farming, and about emergencies. They never present a single individual who tells you that that's true. The only people who are telling you that are rich, educated elitists who live in Washington, D.C. and Manhattan. That should tell you something, shouldn't it? Meanwhile, the CEO of NPR, very concerned about freedom of the press.
That as well. So, David, can you put into perspective?
Oh, excuse me. This is better than the CEO of NPR. This is conservative columnist and commentator. Conservative columnist and commentator David French.
How much the NPR case is escalating a nationwide culture attack on free speech?
Yeah, I've not seen anything like this in my adult lifetime. I think we're looking at a comprehensive attack on free speech that is maybe most reminiscent of the Red Scare. And, you know, the one thing that is so particularly pernicious about it is that Donald Trump is very shrewd, politically shrewd in his attack. He's taking on a lot of institutions.
Okay. A pernicious and comprehensive attack on the First Amendment. Defunding NPR is a pernicious and comprehensive attack on the First Amendment. David French making the conservative case for taxpayer-funded propaganda on NPR. You can't make this up. I know it seems quaint, but let me just posit to you and to you, David French, you true conservative. Can I just posit that you are not obligated as an American citizen and voter to pay for propaganda that tears you down, tears down your ideas, and tears down the very notion of the country that you live in and love? You're not obligated to pay for this. And you shouldn't feel guilty about saying, no, not money out of my pocket. Sorry, not sorry. So they had the crops and flooding and emergency information that is vital and terribly important. They had the lie that they're not politically biased. They've got the attack on the free speech and freedom of the press. None of those arguments worked. So finally, after they lost the vote, Amy Klobuchar, she tried one last ditch effort, one last argument to save PBS.
This is completely outrageous. Remember, this is money that was already decided on by a Republican House, a Democratic Senate. It was a bipartisan agreement. And if they can just start to go in there and take away these incredibly important funds, the sky's the limit. So that's my first point to her.
Okay, so really fast to the first point. That's all they've got. Hey, we had a deal. You can't go back on the deal. You agreed to pay for this garbage. Now you're going back and saying you don't want to pay for the garbage. Well, a big change happened. We got a new president. And the White House said, hey, on second thought, we don't need this money. I know Biden asked for it, but the people elected me. I don't want it, so take the money back. But her only argument is, we had a deal. You can't go back on the deal. Yeah, we can. But then she makes the last argument again about needing your alerts if you live in those rural communities, because you're just too dumb to figure things out without PBS.
Republican colleagues, what are you doing? I guess you'll just rubber stamp anything Donald Trump wants. But the second one is, look at what this is for. Just as we've seen these weather disasters, including horrifically in Texas, but the fires in Arizona and the like, in many remote areas, or if in states like Florida with hurricane season upon us, they rely on a series of public broadcasting to get alerts out. And when it works well, when you actually have a system set up, it works well. This is not the time to cut back on public radio and public TV. And one thing people don't know, 2 to 1 on the percentage that comes from federal funding, 2 to 1, it's double for rural, the percentage, over what it is for urban and other stations. So that's the case we're going to be making, in addition to the obvious on the foreign aid, when it's really about our security, when we're in the middle of all these peace negotiations in the Mideast. Why would you mess around with funding that people have relied on and trust America to provide?
That's right. They trust us in the Middle East to provide the Iraqi version of Sesame Street. Otherwise, some jihadi is going to go blow themselves up. Thanks, Amy Klobuchar. There you go. It's always the white, elite, educated, liberal Democrat making the case on television to other white, educated, liberal, elite Democrats. The people in rural areas demand these public radio stations. They can't do without them. What you'll never see is that same Senator, Amy Klobuchar, then say, in fact, if you don't mind, Joe, just a sec here, I've got Jane Smith from a rural area in my state. She'll tell you that story. Oh, and Jane, when you're done, hang on a second. I've got this person, Joe Jones. This person can't get a photo identification for voter ID. See, this person right here does not have a photo ID and is incapable of getting a photo ID. That's why we can't have voter ID. Those are two things you never see whenever these white, liberal, well-educated elitists make those cases. They tell you that there are all these people suffering out there, but they never show them to you. Strange, isn't it? Bye-bye, NPR. Bye-bye, PBS. Actually, they're not going anywhere. You just don't have to pay for them anymore. That's all.